In this video, we'll explore the differences between adjusting the curve at the raw stage versus the curve in Photoshop. You would think that these would operate pretty much the same. They have the same name, they have very similar controls. However, they have very important differences, especially with regards to how they treat color in the highlights. So we'll see that, but first let's make sure we're working from the same image. We've got 8563 open as our file and have made several adjustments to it already. If we look at the before, I'm hitting the backslash key, you can see that I brought out tremendous color in the sky as well as really exacerbating these rays coming from the sun. To do that, we need to warm it up, so increase temp to 6900, tint to 42. Then we're going to bring down the highlights to retain that color, so that's minus 35. I brought up the shadows to plus 30. We could arguably go even further, so let's go ahead and do that here to maybe something like plus 60 or so. That just keeping a little bit of detail here for these transition areas. Next, I've brought up the dehaze. If we turn that off for a second, notice how you lose some of that transition in the sky. So adding dehaze has helped accentuate this feeling of the sun's rays in the sky. Brought up vibrance to plus 30. Have added some split toning. So you can see without the split toning and with have just sort of warmed up the sky there. So that's the highlights have a hue of 16 at a saturation of 25. And then the shadows cooled down a little bit at 233 and 19. And then camera calibration have boosted the saturation in both the red and blues considerably, and then brought down the tint in the shadows a little bit. Since the overall image has a magenta color cast to it, I wanted to bring the tint down a little bit in the shadows here to help bring it closer to the underlying brighter exposure that will blend together, because you always want to try and match color as much as you can between these exposures. Probably I should even push it a little bit further, but I just try to get it in the ballpark for the purposes of blending. A little bit of correction here can really help in any areas of overlap and transition. So this is very close to the way I would process this for blending in Photoshop, with one exception. I would go to the tone curve here and bring the light slider up quite a bit. And in doing so, you can see how it really brings out a much more powerful feeling in the sky and accentuates the sun coming through here. However, we're not going to do that here. We'll do this with the raw object over in Photoshop, but I want to first copy this over so we have the same thing to work with twice. So right click on the image, choose to edit in and open as a smart object in Photoshop. Once you have this over in Photoshop, we need to duplicate this smart object, but we need to do so in a way where the copy is independent. So the right way to do this is to right click and choose New Smart Object via Copy. Do not use the keyboard shortcut. If you do that, you'll actually be creating a duplicate that is linked to the other copy. So instead, just right click, choose New Smart Object via Copy. Now that we have this, we're going to adjust one of these with curves and one of these inside the raw smart object. So let's hide this for the moment. And in this bottom one, let's call this Raw Edit. And in the top one, we'll put a curve down. Actually, we can leave this visible. And we're going to select both and create a group on them. And let's just call this Curve Edit. So now we can hide this group. So let's go and first adjust the bottom. So what we'll do is we'll adjust the curve inside of this Camera Raw Smart Object. So double click it. Inside, you'll go to the curve. It's the second icon here. And this interface is a little bit different than Lightroom. It has the same results. However, you get numeric inputs here, and that's why I like doing this particular comparison in Photoshop, so we can get the exact same adjustments. What we want to do is bring up these highlights. So click, and let's choose 190 and how about 240 for an adjustment here to bring out a much more powerful sky. And that's maybe more than I need, but let's go with that. We just need to make sure we copy these same values to our other curve. So hit OK. Then let's open up this curve here, double click it, and again, click to add a point and make sure it's at 190 and 240. 190 input, 240 output. So this curve is identical to the curve placed in here. And yet if we look at the results, so on top here, the curve is affecting this layer and we can't see what's beneath because it's fully covering everything underneath. So as we look at the curve edit versus the underlying edit that we did inside the raw smart object, there is a dramatic difference across the entire image. Notice the shadows have been lightened up, so the tonal differences are pretty substantial. And then you can see in the sky here, in the underlying raw edit, there's much more color in this area. It's much more pink. It looks much more smooth. When we look at the curve here, you can see it's much more washed out. The center is not as pink. The edges are certainly not as pink. And then the biggest difference here, let's just zoom in on these clouds here and look at the raw edit where these clouds stay nice versus the curve edit where it seems to be blowing out the color channel and just really pushing to the limits here. So what happens is these curves do not give the same result, and I can't say overall if it's better or worse, but when it comes to taking a moderately bright color and pushing it to a much brighter color like we're trying to do with the sunset here, I think doing it at the raw stage looks much better. You're not going to have these blown areas for your brightest highlights, and overall the result just looks much better. So when you're processing for the sky, remember, if you're going to use curves to bring out detail, try and do it in your original raw. It's going to give you a much better result in many cases that's just nearly impossible to replicate in Photoshop.